He wasn't famous yet. He wasn't even a suspect. Just a quiet baker in Anchorage, a man people waved to without a second thought. But on December 22nd, 1971, everything changed. That night, a young woman came forward, terrified, shaking, but determined to speak. She told police that Robert Hansen had picked her up, taken her to a remote cabin just outside the city, and assaulted her repeatedly. She said he threatened her with a gun, told her he'd make her disappear, and that no one would ever find her body in the snow. And here's the part that still chills investigators. She escaped only because Hansen fell asleep, and she ran barefoot through the Alaskan cold until she reached help. Police arrested him immediately. They had a victim. They had a statement. They even had the location. Yet somehow, Robert Hansen walked away with a lenient plea deal and a short sentence, framed as a domestic issue, brushed off as if it were nothing. Anchorage shrugged, the case faded, and the quiet baker went back to work. No one realized that this wasn't a moment of weakness. It was a trial run, a test, one the butcher baker would refine into something far darker than anyone imagined. Anchorage in the early 1970s looked peaceful from the outside. Snow-covered streets, small businesses, military families. A growing city on the edge of the wilderness. But underneath that calm surface, Anchorage had a problem nobody wanted to talk about. The pipeline boom had dragged in thousands of workers, rough, transient men who came with cash, loneliness, and a thirst for nightlife. Strip clubs, massage parlors, and makeshift brothels exploded across the city. Women came from all over the country, chasing fast money, and far too many of them went missing without anyone filing a report. Police departments were understaffed, cases slipped through the cracks. A missing dancer was often written off as another girl who left town. And in the middle of all this chaos lived a man people thought they knew. A shy baker with a stutter, a hobbyist hunter, a man with a wife, kids, and a clean reputation. Someone the community saw as harmless. Anchorage had unknowingly built the perfect environment for someone like him. Victims who wouldn't be missed. Locations no one patrolled. And a vast, silent wilderness stretching out behind the city. A place where a man could do anything, and the snow would hide the rest. While most people saw Anchorage as a frontier town full of opportunity, he saw a hunting ground. A place where he could escalate without anyone noticing. A place where one lenient plea deal wasn't a warning. It was an invitation. After the first reported attack was brushed aside, he realized something dangerous. Anchorage wasn't watching him. And no one was protecting the women he targeted. That's when he escalated. He started visiting the strip clubs and bars along 4th Avenue, places filled with dancers, escorts, and runaways trying to survive fast nights and cold mornings. He learned their routines, listened to their stories, and figured out exactly who would be easiest to isolate. He didn't rush. He didn't get sloppy. He planned. He used charm where it worked, intimidation where it didn't. And when he picked a target, he followed a pattern investigators would only discover years later. He'd offer money, promise a quick job. Then, once they were inside his car, his cabin, or his basement, the situation changed. A gun came out. Threats, restraints. Women who refused to comply were forced to, and those who fought back were met with something far colder. And then came the part that truly separated him from the typical predators Anchorage police dealt with. he used his small bush plane. Most killers stay close to home. He did the opposite. He flew victims out into the deep Alaskan wilderness. Miles of untouched terrain, thick forest, frozen ground, no roads, no houses, no help. He chose spots he knew from hunting: dry riverbeds, ridge lines, old game trails, places only he could navigate. Survivors who later testified said he bragged about letting them go briefly, just to hunt them. To him, it wasn't an attack. It was a twisted form of sport. One victim, who managed to survive long enough to speak with police, described being taken to a remote stretch of land where the only sounds were wind, trees, and his boots crunching behind her. This wasn't improvisation. It was routine. The wilderness became his killing field. The airplane became his tool. And Anchorage, distracted, chaotic, overwhelmed, had no idea a serial predator was operating at a level they had never seen before. By the time authorities realized something was deeply wrong, several women had vanished into the trees, the snow, and the silence. Happened in the early hours of June 13th, 1983. A trucker, driving down a dark Anchorage road, spotted a young woman sprinting toward traffic, handcuffed, barefoot, and shaking so badly she could barely speak. She was 17, and she had just escaped a man the city still believed was harmless. Her name was Cindy Paulson, and her statement changed everything. She told police she'd been picked up, threatened with a handgun, and taken to a small cabin deep in the woods, a place filled with hunting trophies, chains, and a meticulously organized workshop. She described every detail: the rug, the layout, the tools, even the plane parked outside. Most victims never got that close a look. She did. And she didn't stop there. She said that after hours of terror, he'd tried to load her into his plane, the same small bush plane he used for remote trips. While he prepared the cockpit, she ran, bolted barefoot across the gravel, dove under a truck, and refused to let go until the driver called for help. Her description was exact. The make of the plane, the location of the airstrip, the man's face. Police knew instantly who she was talking about. The same quiet baker they'd arrested years earlier on a sexual assault case that had been conveniently softened by the courts. This time, they didn't look the other way. Detectives visited his home. They found inconsistencies in his story, items that matched hers, and scratches on his body he couldn't explain. But what made Cindy's statement unbreakable was her precision. She wasn't guessing. She was remembering. Still, even with a victim, police needed more. They needed bodies. They needed evidence tying him to the dozens of women who had vanished. So they did something Anchorage had never done before. They brought in federal profilers, launched coordinated searches, and opened every missing person case from the last decade. One teenager's escape didn't just expose a predator. It triggered a full-scale investigation that would uncover horrors buried beneath the snow for years. Cindy Paulson was the first woman he couldn't silence. And because of her, the city finally started asking the right questions. With Cindy Paulson's testimony in hand, investigators finally had a direction. Now they needed proof, something undeniable. They started by interviewing every dancer, escort, and missing person contact from the previous decade. Patterns emerged, names that had vanished, women last seen in the same clubs Hansen visited, women who got into cars that looked a lot like his. But the breakthrough came when detectives searched the local airfields. Just like Cindy said, his Piper Super Cub bush plane was there, and on the registration paperwork was his hunting license number. That number matched something chilling. When they checked Alaska's hunting records, troopers found Hansen had charted dozens of remote trips, not for elk, not for moose, but for locations far outside normal hunting zones. It looked less like a hunter's log and more like a travel pattern. That's when the FBI stepped in. Profiler John Douglas examined Hansen's history, the stutter, the resentment, the earlier assaults, the preference for vulnerable victims, the need for control. He told Anchorage troopers exactly what to look for: souvenirs, a map, weapons kept for intimidation, trophy spots in the wilderness tied to multiple victims. Armed with that insight, troopers obtained a full search warrant. What they found in Hansen's home changed the case instantly. Inside a hidden nook in his basement was a stash of jewelry, dozens of pieces, rings, necklaces, bracelets, items belonging to missing women whose cases had gone cold. And then they found the most incriminating item of all: a detailed aviation map of the Alaskan wilderness. Tiny red X's marked across remote riverbeds, ridges, and clearings. Some X's had names, some had dates. Others were blank, places he hadn't talked about yet. Detectives knew exactly what it meant, and when they confronted him with it, his calm facade cracked. Under pressure, and facing a mountain of evidence he couldn't explain away, Hansen finally admitted what investigators already suspected. The map marked the locations of women he'd taken into the wilderness. Search teams flew to each X one by one. In the frozen ground, among shallow graves and disturbed soil, they began recovering remains. Victims who had disappeared silently into the snow years earlier. The quiet baker wasn't just a predator. He was one of the most calculated serial killers in Alaskan history. And all of it, the map, the trophies, the plane, the confessions, built a case strong enough to end the hunt for good. By late 1983, the evidence against him wasn't just strong, it was overwhelming. The jewelry box, the map, the survivor, the bodies recovered from the wilderness. His carefully cultivated mask had finally cracked. Detectives brought him into custody, and for the first time in his life, he had no leverage. The quiet, polite baker who kept to himself tried to talk his way out of it, but the room wasn't listening. They had the map. They had the locations. They had the matches to missing women. When investigators laid out the items recovered from his home, his demeanor shifted. He knew the game was over. But Alaska wanted more than a confession. They wanted the truth. All of it. The deal. Prosecutors offered him a choice: cooperate fully, admit to every victim, point out every marked grave on the map, or face charges so stacked he'd die in court before a trial ever began. He took the deal. Over days of interviews, he admitted to abducting and murdering multiple women throughout the 1970s and early 80s. He described flying them into remote wilderness, choosing each site because he knew the terrain and believed no one would ever find them. He provided details investigators could verify, details only the killer would know. In exchange for his cooperation, the state agreed not to pursue the death penalty, which Alaska didn't have anyway, and instead locked him into a sentence that ensured he would never see freedom again. Final count. He eventually admitted to 17 murders, but investigators always believed the real number was higher. There were 24 red X's on his map. Not all of them were identified. The sentencing. In 1984, he stood before an Alaska judge and received a punishment almost unheard of at the time: 461 years in prison, plus life, with no chance of parole. It was one of the harshest sentences ever handed down in the state. He was shipped off to a maximum security facility, his plane confiscated, his property seized, his reputation in ashes. The friendly neighborhood baker, the man who blended into Anchorage life so easily, would spend the rest of his days behind steel and concrete. He died in prison in 2014 at age 75, never expressing real remorse, never acknowledging the true number of victims, and leaving behind unanswered questions buried in Alaska's wilderness. But his downfall began with a survivor who refused to stay silent, and a map that exposed every lie he had ever lived. When the truth finally came out, Anchorage reacted with a mix of shock, anger, and disbelief. For more than a decade, a man everyone thought they knew, a friendly baker, a churchgoer, a local business owner, had been hunting women in the woods like it was a sport. The city felt betrayed. Newspapers ran headlines calling him one of the most calculating predators Alaska had ever seen. Families of missing women demanded answers. And the nightlife districts, where dancers and sex workers had lived in constant danger without knowing why, were suddenly filled with fear and outrage. But the biggest impact hit law enforcement. Police admitted failures. Anchorage detectives acknowledged publicly what had been whispered for years. The city had underestimated the danger these missing person reports represented. Women working in the clubs had been written off as transient. Complaints had been ignored. Early victims hadn't been protected. His case exposed every gap in the system. Major changes followed. Within months, Alaska overhauled the way it handled missing person reports, cases involving dancers and sex workers, serial offender profiling, cross-agency communication, wilderness search procedures. Anchorage PD set up dedicated units for cases involving vulnerable women, something the city had never taken seriously until the bodies started appearing in the snow. State troopers began cataloging wilderness crime scenes differently, using aerial mapping and forensic grids. The FBI strengthened its presence in Alaska, bringing profiler support earlier in cases instead of after years of damage. The community shift. People in Anchorage realized just how isolated they truly were. The wilderness they'd grown up admiring, the rivers, the forests, the quiet mountains, suddenly felt like part of the crime scene. Bars and clubs implemented new safety rules. Women working downtown created their own informal network, warning each other about dangerous clients and sharing license plate numbers. For the first time, their voices were taken seriously. His shadow stayed. Even after he died in 2014, the impact of his crimes didn't fade. Some families never recovered remains. Some X's on his map remained unanswered. And to this day, Alaskan investigators still revisit cold cases from the 70s and 80s, checking them against his timeline, his flights, his habits. His downfall forced a frontier city to confront a truth it never wanted to face. Predators thrive in silence, and silence is easy in a place as vast and wild as Alaska. Because of the survivor who escaped and the investigation that followed, Anchorage changed its laws, its policing, and its awareness permanently.